This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
We were hoping not to have to be here today, not to be sitting on the floor mourning, saying kinnis. We were hoping that that great day would have already come. We were hoping that by now, Mashiach would have come, Sasan v'simcha yimatzei ba, but b'avonoseinu harabim, because of our many sins, here we are again. Avar katzir kol hakayetz, ba'anachnu lo noshanu. What will that great day look like? What will it feel like? We would expect it to be the happiest, most joyous day in our history. A day of exhilaration, a day of euphoria. We could just imagine the happiness we will feel when Mashiach comes. And yet the Navi Zechariah says otherwise. The Navi Zechariah says in Perek Yud Beis, Bayom hahu, on that fateful day, on that great day, Yigdal ha-misbeit b'Yerushalayim. The mourning, the crying in Yerushalayim will be enormous. V'safta ha'aretz mishpachos levad. And all the families in Yerushalayim will be crying and mourning. The Navi Zechariah is telling us that the day of the coming of Mashiach will be the saddest, most painful day in the history of the Jewish people. Did we hear correctly? Crying? Mourning for Mashiach? Isn't it a happy occasion? Isn't it a time of joy? Says the Navi Zechariah, no. More tears will be shed when Mashiach comes than ever before. How do we understand this? Throughout our history, the Jewish people have suffered, have been persecuted far more than any other nation. In Mitzrayim, we were brutalized. The Babylonians killed hundreds of thousands. The Romans killed millions. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the pogroms, the Holocaust. We know the whole Megillah. No nation experienced what we did. But we survived. How did we survive? How did we do it? And I don't mean physically. Physically we survived, like Yaakov Avinu says, Im yavo Esav el hamachane ha'achas v'hikol, that if Esav will come to one camp and strike it down, v'haya ha'machane ha'nishar lefleita, there will always be a surviving camp. There will always be a she'eris ha'pleita. Hashem in His kindness has always spared a small remnant who escaped, picked themselves up, dusted themselves off, rolled up their sleeves, and started again. But I don't mean physically. I mean emotionally, psychologically, mentally. How did the survivors have the fortitude and the mental strength not to collapse, not to go mad, not to be crushed emotionally, not to be completely demoralized? How is that possible? Let's take the Rokeach. Rabbi Lezer Migarmaiza, the Rokeach of Worms. He was born in Germany in the year 1160. He wrote the famous work Rokeach. The gematria of Rokeach is Elazar, named after his own name. The Rokeach was a student of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. He was a student of his father. They both instructed him in Kabbalah. They both transmitted to him the precise text and the mystical meanings of all the prayers dating back to the Tanoim. Rabbi Elazar wrote a commentary on the Sefer HaYetzirah. He wrote something called Sidei Razia. He wrote Sharei Bina. He wrote Sefer Hashem. He wrote many other unpublished treatises on Kabbalah. In the year 1197, the Crusaders came into his home, murdered Rabbi Elazar's wife in front of his own eyes, took his two daughters, shechted them before his eyes. They wounded him, they wounded his sons. The Rokeach survived. Rabbi Elazar survived the tragic incident. Yeah, he survived physically. But how would he continue? His wife murdered before his very eyes? His two daughters murdered before his very eyes? To live constantly haunted by those images? How would he continue? Many would say, perhaps the dead were better off than the living. Fast forward to the 15th century. The tragic saga of Rabbi Avram Saba. Rabbi Avram Saba was a an accomplished scholar already in 1492 by the time of the expulsion from Spain and the time of Gerish Sfarad. He was so great that his granddaughter married Maran Bet Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo. 1492, Rabbi Avram Saba, he flees from Spain. He goes to Oporto, Portugal. He hoped to find safe haven for his family in Portugal, but unfortunately it was not meant to be. During his first peaceful years in Portugal, Rabbi Avram completed his commentaries on the Torah, on the 5 Megillos, on Pirkei Avos, but after a few years, all the Jews were exiled, were expelled from Portugal, but that was the least of their worries, because King Emmanuel had a terrible surprise in store for the Jews of Portugal. Before the expulsion, all Jewish children below the age of 18 were snatched away from their parents and forcibly converted by the church. Rabbi Avram's 2 young sons were both kidnapped, forcefully baptized. He never saw them again. I mean, how do you go on? Honestly, how does a human being continue? I mean, death is far better than the living nightmare of knowing your 2 Yingalach have been kidnapped, converted, not knowing where they are. I mean, death is paradise compared to living. But that was not all. All of Rabbi Saba's Sfarim, his entire library of precious handwritten manuscripts, were confiscated, burnt publicly in Lisbon, together with hundreds and thousands of other Sfarim. Bereft, Rabbi Avram Saba fled with only one consolation. He still had a secret personal treasure. The manuscripts of the Sfarim he had written, the manuscripts of the Tzrar Hamar, on the Torah, on the 5 Megillos, and on Pirkei Avos, he had hidden in a corner of his home. One day, friends told Rabbi Avram Saba that his secret had been revealed. And if he would not personally destroy his manuscripts, his life would be in danger. With a broken heart, Rabbi Avram Saba buries his precious manuscripts under an olive tree. Never saw them again. And then you come to the Holocaust. We have suffered many terrible devastation and destruction, annihilation during the course of 2,000 years. But this long history of persecution was perhaps overshadowed and eclipsed by the events of the Holocaust. Between 6 and 7 million Jews slain by the Germans, a figure unprecedented in the 2,000 years of Galus. On a national level, impossible to comprehend the scope of the disaster. But even the isolated stories are mind-boggling, far too mind-boggling for the mind to fathom. Daniel Goldhagen wrote a very important work, Hitler's Willing Executioners. And on page 369, he cites the words of a death march survivor. One night, during a forced death march from the Dora Mittelbau camp, we stopped near the town of Gardelegen. We lay down in a field, and several Germans went out to the forest to consult what they should do with us. They returned with a lot of young people from the Hitler Youth, with members of the police force from the town. They chased us all into a large barn. We were 5,000 to 6,000 people, and the walls of the barn collapsed from the pressure of the mass of the gathering. Many of us fled, but the more than 5,000 that remained behind, the Germans came, poured petrol on us, and set the barn on fire. Several thousand people were burnt alive. Those of us who managed to escape lay down in the nearby woods and heard the heart-rending screams of the victims. This was April 13th, 1945. April 14th, one day later, Eisenhower's army conquered the city. When the Americans got there, the bodies were still burning. There were many survivors of this incident. But how did they continue? Haunted forever by the image of their brothers and sisters and parents and grandparents burning? haunted forever by the stench of the burning bodies? Allow me to read for you the transcript of Rivka Yasalauska's testimony at the Eichmann trial. A testimony by which Hausner reported that her story shattered the courtroom. Loud sobbing was heard from the audience. Tears flowed freely from many eyes. Her testimony goes as follows. The Jewish quarter was suddenly surrounded by hundreds of SS men who with shouts and whiplashes ordered all the Jews out of their homes. We were chased like animals to the central square of the town, where they were kept until the next morning without food and water. Rivka Yasalauska said, "I did not believe they would kill us. I hoped it would only be torture." She stood there clinging to her 6-year-old daughter Malka. Her mother, her grandmother, her 2 sisters were all nearby. The SS officers started shooting, one by one, every last person, firing point blank into the back of each victim's head, then kicking the body into the open pit. Rivka Yasalauska saw her father and mother and sisters disappear into the ditch. Then the Germans approached her grandmother, who was holding 2 little girls, pointing to the Shamayim, telling them in only a few moments we would all be together greeting our loved ones. In one moment, they were all gone. The German who shot at Rivka Yasalauska missed his aim, then kicked her into the pit where she thought she would bleed to death and suffocate. Many hours later, she regained her consciousness. She said she felt like she was choking to death, desperately needing air. She lifted herself above the bodies who were clutching at her, biting her, pulling her down. But by then the shooting was over and the Germans were gone. She had only the skies above her and an endless grave under her feet. So she survived. But she saw her father, her mother, her grandmother, her sister, her daughter murdered before her eyes. I mean, what's the point in going on? How would one continue? Reb Chaim Shmulevitz, the Goyen, the great Rosh Yeshiva, the Mir Yeshiva, would say over frequently the story of the mother. Her 2 children were brought to the train which was going to carry them to the death camps. The unfortunate mother stood helplessly by the stairs, begging the German soldier to spare her children. The Nazi said, "Take one of them." The mother took one of her children, clutched him to her chest. The second child jumps onto the mother, weeping, "Mama, Mama, why don't you take me? Why don't you take me?" She didn't know what to do. She puts down the first child. She picks up the second child. The first child bursts out crying, "Mama, are you leaving me? Are you forsaking me?" Her heart was torn. She couldn't decide. The end of the story was, both children remained on the train. The entirely distraught mother stayed behind, bereft of both of her children. She was alive. She survived. But for what? For what purpose? Im yava Esav el hamachane ha'achas v'yiko. V'hoya hamachane hanisha lefleita. But what's the point of surviving? What's the tachlis of it? How can the survivors continue emotionally? I recently read in a book entitled After the Holocaust, The Immigration of Polish Jews to Pittsburgh, written by a woman, Barbara Stern, where one survivor reported that the Jewish agencies didn't get it. They gave us furniture, they even gave us food, but we needed a social worker, we needed a psychiatrist, and there was no one to help us. Another survivor was even more outspoken, describing her early years in America as a second Holocaust. She writes, "We needed emotional support, and there was no one who could give it to us. And somehow, some way, Klal Yisrael survives. We made it through. We're standing, and we're forging ahead. How did we do it? How were we able to do it?" Says Rav Simcha Wasserman, the son of the great Rabbi Chanan, Hashem Yimkom Damai. The Navi Yecheskel tells us in Perek Lamed Vav, "Binasati lachem lev chadash," that on the great day of the coming of Mashiach, God will give us a new heart. "V'ruach chadasha etein b'kirbechem," and I will place a new spirit within you. "V'hasiroisi es lev ha'even mi b'sarchem," I will remove your heart of stone. "Binasati lachem lev basar," I will give you a heart of flesh. Says Rav Simcha Wasserman, we see from this pasuk in Yecheskel that God has given us hearts of stone, a lev even, that in the Golus we do not have a heart of flesh and blood. We have hearts of stone. For what purpose? Why would God give us a heart of stone? Says Rav Simcha Wasserman, after all we've read, after all we've heard, it should be self-evident. God has given us a heart of stone to be able to emotionally survive the Golus. God has given us hearts of stone so that when our wives and children are murdered in front of our eyes during the Crusades, so that when millions of children are kidnapped and baptized, so that when families are torn apart, when relatives are shot before our eyes, we don't turn mad. We don't become insane. We don't go out of our kalim. So that a little bit, the Ribbon Shalom has made us numb. We don't feel it. We are not fully sensitive to the magnitude of the tragedy. Hashem has hardened our hearts, desensitized our hearts, in order to preserve our sanity and normalcy. But truth be told, says Rav Simcha, it's not all that good to have a heart of stone. We're supposed to be compassionate people, sensitive people. We're supposed to be sensitive to the needs of others. We're supposed to have a leiv basar. So having a heart of stone is not an ideal situation, only a necessary one. But on that day, on that great day of the coming of Mashiach, God is going to remove our hearts of stone. Binasati lachem leiv chadash. God is going to give us a new heart. V'ruach chadasha etein b'kirbechem. Binasati lachem leiv basar. On that day, God will give us a heart of flesh. At which point we will look back at 2,000 years of Golus. We will look back at all the lives cut short, the kidnappings, the children stolen from our people, the brutality, the families torn apart, the 1 million children murdered in the Holocaust. And it's going to hit us like a ton of bricks. It is going to pierce our raw hearts. And after being numb for 2,000 years, it will be a dagger to the heart. And on that great day, we will cry, and we will cry, and we will cry. Bayom hahu, Yigdal ha-misbeid b'Yerushalayim. On that great day, the mourning in Yerushalayim will be overwhelming, because we have 2,000 years of crying to make up for. But until that great day comes, we don't really feel it. We have a leiv even. We have a heart of stone. But one day a year, God sensitizes our hearts. One day a year, just a little bit, Hashem allows us to feel the pain, to feel the tsar. Just one day a year, we get a little glimpse of what that day will be like. V'haya ha-misbeid yigdal b'Yerushalayim. And the avodas hayom, the avodah, the job of the Jew on the day of Tisha B'Av, is to feel just a little bit, to offer perhaps just one sincere tear. Says the Gemara in Brachos and Daf Lamed Beis Amud Beis. V'amar Rabbi Elazar, miyom shecharav Beis Hamikdash ninalu sharei tefillah. From the day that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the gates of prayer have been sealed shut. V'afal pi sheninalu sharei tefillah. Even though the gates of prayer have been sealed shut, sharei demais lo ninalu. The gates of tears are not locked. Perhaps then our avodah is that if on Tisha B'Av we can shed one sincere tear, we go straight up to the Ribono Shel Olam through the Sharei Demois She'eino Ninalois, and be Ma'orer Avinu Shemashamayim to bring the Gula Shlema from Her V'Yameinu. Amen.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.